Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the United Nations doing to work to eliminate the scourge of war, to promote economic and social development, and to enhance human rights? How do these programs impact people around the world? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to the program. Today we're looking at the United Nations as an institution that's working to eliminate war, to promote economic and social development, and to encourage human rights around the world. My guest is a veteran journalist and also an author who is very knowledgeable of the United Nations. Linda Fasulo, a veteran independent reporter who covers the UN for the National Public Radio, has also worked as a UN correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC. Ms. Fasulo is the author of An Insider's Guide to the United Nations, 2nd edition. Linda Fasulo, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you.
I appreciate you being with me today. I mentioned right at the end that you are the author of An Insider's Guide to the United Nations, 2nd edition, and I just happen to have a copy here,
nice.
which is very convenient. But anyway, tell us a bit about this book. Why did you decide you wanted to write about the United Nations? I know you've covered the UN for many years, but why did you think it was important to write and to focus on the UN?
Well, I had been covering the UN for probably a decade at that point, and it was a very exciting time. It was the 1990s. The UN was in high gear, and I thought that it was important to sort of dig deeper. In other words, and also I had access to the ambassadors and diplomats, UN officials of the day, from working as a breaking news journalist. And so I thought, I think I'd like to know more. I want to go behind the scenes personally. So it was personally driven. Another part of it is I used to go around speaking to various organizations, and I'd find that I would get all kinds of questions about the UN, some completely off base, attributing all kinds of powers to the UN that it didn't have, others thinking the UN could do nothing. So I thought, this might be the right time to do something, sort of try to do a user-friendly guide to the UN.
And that is very true. We don't get a lot of information on the United Nations. We really don't read much about it. We read drips and drabs a bit here about maybe peacekeeping or Security Council doing something or whatever the case might be, but there really is not a comprehensive overview. But your book has certainly taken care of that, and you walk through the 6 organs of the United Nations. You look at the specialized agencies and a variety of other parts of the UN. Who was your intended audience at first? Was this more for the general public? Was that the idea?
Exactly. It was for the general public. And what I found, of course, also is that there is a good market in schools. There's probably more interest in colleges and high schools today than there's ever been. And so that's a natural audience. And I also find what's interesting is that very often a diplomat or a UN new staff member will tell me, oh, I picked up your book in the library or in the bookstore, and it was helpful to me to understand the larger picture. And so that's always wonderful to hear.
And it seems as though, especially in the United States, and maybe this is not true around the world, but it seems like they're teaching less and less about international issues and the United Nations in particular. Many years ago, some newspapers even devoted part of a page or an entire page to activities at the United Nations, something that happened that day or the day before. And of course, there are many things happening at the UN with the Security Council, the General Assembly, with the peacekeeping, as we mentioned, with humanitarian agencies, especially with the humanitarian efforts now in the Horn of Africa and other places. But there's a lot going on at the UN that doesn't get into print or we don't hear about.
I think that's very true. I think that despite the UN sort of being stretched out in so many countries around the world, and of course when you think about a humanitarian disaster, it's very often the UN is there first and foremost and helping with that problem. But I think that sometimes that gets covered, from the field. A lot of times it sort of gets wrapped up into a larger story of the politics of it. And I think here in New York, for example, it's mainly a diplomatic post. And unless the Security Council or the other UN organs are really involved in major issues of the day that are front page news, it's very difficult to get stories in newspapers or on radio or on TV.
Well, let's think back. Let's flash back to 1945 just for a moment. And we saw that the war was coming to an end. Over 60 million people had been killed in the horrific World War II. The United Nations came online June 26th, really right before the war ended in August. But if you think back to the delegates when they were coming into San Francisco, these people came to form an organization that really rose like a phoenix bird out of the ashes of destruction of World War II. And these delegates got off the plane, they met, they argued, they agreed on a lot. But in fact, a couple of times the conference almost got derailed because they couldn't agree. The Soviet Union and the U.S. couldn't agree on what to do with the veto in the Security Council. There were other contentious issues. But how do you look at the United Nations that was created by these delegates in San Francisco in June of 1945 as the United Nations of today? How has it changed? I know there are many changes. But how do you view that?
I think first and foremost, the sheer size of the UN. When you think about the UN's founding, you were talking about 50 countries, 51, and it's basically almost 4 times that. So it's a much larger, and some will say unwieldy organization. And there's much more of a diversity of country. I think countries then were much more homogeneous in the sense of their interests. Today, of course, you have such a proliferation of poor countries that have very different interests and concerns than perhaps richer countries. And so the UN has broadened, I think, its efforts to sort of meet everyone's interests.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good point, because when the delegates came to San Francisco, there were only 50. I think Poland came in a bit later. It was 50,
right,
the
the
51st. And of course, most of the countries today, the 193 countries of the UN, were under colonial rule. They were under the British or the French or the Dutch or whomever it might be, and they were not even independent countries at that time. So the institution has changed quite dramatically in that area.
And probably there's a sense that the founders, I think most people think, didn't envision that it would get that large. But so it's interesting that it's even survived when you really think about it. I was thinking the other day that the UN is sort of 65, ready for Social Security. Some would say it's critics, but it's amazing that it's thriving and is involved in such diverse activities.
65 is not that bad.
No,
I hear. That's what they tell me.
But
anyway.
Sometimes critics, point to that.
Right, exactly. No, that's very, very true. Well, it is. Now, as you were doing the research on your book, what were some of the more interesting aspects you ran into? Any surprises? You've been at the UN, you've covered the UN for many years, but when you start talking to people about doing a book, were there any interesting insights that you got that maybe you hadn't had before you started working on this book, or interesting anecdotes or inside information, that type of thing?
I think what was very interesting is how the UN functions behind the scenes, and that how human beings, people really make a big difference in terms of the role they play at the UN. And very much it's personality driven. And, there'll be, some people say there are 35 or 40 people in the UN who really run the show. And of course, what does that really mean? It means perhaps that they're the ones who come up with the initiatives, they're the ones who can put together coalitions and thus have greater influence. And I guess that's like, in any institution, whether it's Congress, for example, that's a similar one. That's always the case. You always have your people. But it's interesting when you think of it from a global perspective, because people have very different interests. And so one thing I've always found fascinating is the human element, is that being here, it's sort of, and talking to people, it sort of demystifies, this isn't just an organization that sort of comes out with a declaration or a resolution. It's like magic. I mean, you get to understand how it all works. And I don't know, I just found that very fascinating to getting a grip on things.
Mm-hmm. And as you walk around the United Nations, it's really a very open institution to a large degree. And I would imagine you have a lot of access to diplomats.
Exactly.
In other settings, that might not even be possible.
Right. in the pre-renovation days, shall we say, when the UN is functioning in its usual way, and it's in the office, like this, when the Security Council really is in the horseshoe room, yes, that's what's magnificent. I think almost very unique about covering, and which is why I loved it, is that the access is incredible. You have direct access. I mean, of course, diplomats will come to a stakeout and talk to the whole group, but nonetheless, you can then walk with them. You could talk with them privately. You can go to the diplomatic lounge. You can meet people. I got my greatest leads in the cafeteria, standing online with a diplomat or UN official. Everyone's relaxed and they'll answer questions. And of course, the diplomatic receptions are always good if you target, who you want to reach. So I think that that's very helpful and, makes it, again, very human.
Now, two of the key organs of the United Nations are the General Assembly and the Security Council. The General Assembly has all 193 countries in the world that are members. It's the town hall of the world, if you will. They pass resolutions. They're non-binding resolutions.
Yes.
But the Security Council is a different operation. They have 15 members, 5 permanent members, and they have a veto, and that makes a tremendous difference. How have you seen the Security Council evolve over the years from what it was back a little bit after the Cold War? Yeah,
right.
that type of thing.
I think the major difference between the end of the Cold War and today is the rise of Russia and China. In the early 90s and throughout the 90s, Russia was not as willing to assert itself. I've been going through bad economic times, and now that it's revived and it's a major power again, we all know that Russia's interests are very well presented here, and Russia will block and object to, situations that perhaps the United States is interested in. I mean, I think a perfect example recently was on Syria, how Russia and China objected to a full legally binding resolution condemning Syria, and what happened? They would have vetoed, and so you ended up with a statement, a non-binding statement. So I think there's really an assertion of China and Russia that you didn't have for the first decade after the end of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'll be back in just a moment after this important message.
Hey, this is Edward Norton for the United Nations. Here's a question for you. If you had to choose, would you rather give up one of your lungs and take away all clean water from your kids, or pay a little more for a shrimp cocktail and a cheeseburger? Sounds kind of obvious, right? But incredibly, every year, we as a global community are making the wrong choice, the foolish choice, to sacrifice our health and the health of our kids and our future by destroying millions of acres of the world's forests every year to support non-essential industries like cheap beef, shrimp, and palm oil production. Now, most people, especially if they live in a big city like I do, wouldn't say that their life depends on a forest or on trees, but it does. Without large, healthy forests on this planet, we would literally have no oxygen to breathe, no clean water to drink, much less food to eat, and almost no medicines to heal us when we're sick. Now, it's time we get our priorities straight. The UN has declared this the International Year of Forests. Join me in calling on our leaders to protect our planet's forests and our future health from the ravages of unsustainable industry. Don't think that you can't make a difference. You can. To find out what you can do, go to www.un.org/forests. Thanks a lot.
Welcome back to our program. Today we're looking at the United Nations and some of the activities that are underway to help eliminate the scourge of war, promote economic and social development, and to enhance human rights. My guest is Linda Fasulo, a veteran journalist who has covered the UN for many years. She's an independent reporter for a variety of organizations, and she's also the author of An Insider's Guide to the United Nations, second edition. And Linda, we've been talking about your book. We could spend days talking about your book, but it's a very readable book. It's an excellent primer on folks who would like to learn a lot more about the United Nations. But before we leave the Security Council, let's talk about that just for a moment. We're talking about how important the Security Council is and has 15 members. But as a lot of the foreign policy experts have pointed out in the past, that really during the first since 1945, when we started the Cold War in 48, a lot of folks have indicated that we fought the Cold War in the Security Council. Not much was accomplished. They had the Korean War in 50 to 53, and then the Belgian Congo crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 61. But it was paralyzed. But today there's really much more of an aura of cooperation rather than confrontation. Now, the countries will not always agree on everything, but they're certainly not fighting it the way they were back during the Cold War, are they?
No, I think that there's a much more openness on the part of all Security Council members to consider all kinds of issues and problems. So I think there's more of, the fact that you go to the UN, there's an expectation if there's a crisis somewhere that the UN will somehow have some role. Now, very often it could be a very minute and tiny role, but I think that there's no doubt that people regard it as a major institution. What it accomplishes, of course, depends on the member states and what their relationships very often are with the protagonists. And sometimes things can really get done effectively, and other times there are stalemates.
Well, the UN has a lot of key players, a lot of key institutions, and of course the key player is the Secretary-General of the UN, and Ban Ki-moon will be into his second 5-year term from 2012 to 2016. He is Secretary-General. How do they view the term? Secretary means one thing, general means another. How do you define secretary and general? It's a dual role.
Right. Well, it's been said the role of Secretary General is an impossible task. First and foremost, of course, he has to be on good terms with 193 nations who are, on a certain level, his boss, his bosses. On the other hand, he wants to play a role in terms of making a difference and executing quiet diplomacy and perhaps directing the UN, the institution, towards issues that might not be on the front burner. So I think, it's obviously very difficult. We all know that the UN is first and foremost a club of 193 nations. And to remain in that post that he's in, he can't be voted out. So I think it's very difficult, because as we know, the world is diverse. One person may be your friend, the other is an enemy, and he's got to deal with all of them, the good, the bad, the ugly.
All 193 countries are the board of directors, and
Right.
anybody who's ever dealt with the board of directors can certainly understand this.
Right, and usually it's maybe 12 or a dozen. I mean, imagine 193.
Yes. Well, I think it was Trygve Lie, I guess, the first Secretary General of the UN, who said to Dag Hammarskjöld, when he came in, he said, this is the most impossible job in the world, and it's a very difficult job. There's certainly no doubt about it. It's a very important job, but it's a very difficult job.
And it's a job that the person, makes a difference who the person is, because there is some latitude in terms of where he or she would want to take the organization. And also a lot depends on the member states in terms of if they're up for an activist Secretary General or they want, a more quiet behind the scenes type. So I guess everything goes in cycles.
And of course, every country that comes in certainly wants to be a key player, wants to be involved in the activities, and all 193 are involved in doing a wide range of things, dealing with climate problems, environmental problems, dealing with human rights, dealing with just on across the board, labor issues. So you pick a topic, and there are some countries that certainly have a vested interest in that. As you look at the United Nations, what recommendations would you make to the UN to strengthen the UN as we roar into the 21st century? Because we have a lot of problems. Climate change is accelerating at a dramatic pace. We see that there are financial problems. The international economic markets are not doing as well as people would like. But what would you recommend to the UN to make it a more effective and a more efficient organization?
Well, I think on a grand level, on the overall level, it's really up to the member states to not pursue their narrow national interests to the degree that many of them do, and perhaps think more globally and what's in the interests of the larger community. Now, of course, that's easier said than done, and that's the idealistic point of view. But there's always talk of UN reform, whether it's reform in terms of cutting costs, whether it's reform in terms of giving managerial reform. For example, we know that the Secretary General's hands are often tied in terms of what he can do. while he's the chief administrative officer and people like to call him the CEO, he really does not have all the powers of a CEO, for example, to hire and fire. Even appointing top-level executives at the UN requires the approval of the General Assembly, and of course that could become a quagmire because of all the competing interests and the fact that many countries want to play a role. That's how they assert their role on the global stage. So it's very difficult. You know, people say if he had more latitude, perhaps things might go better.
Mm-hmm. Now, the United Nations is the only international forum in the world that brings all of the countries of the world together, all 193 countries. It reflects every religion, every economic system, every moray, folkway, value in the world. Such diversity is at the United Nations. And even though there have been, people do not always agree on everything. There will always be differences of opinion, conflict, if you want to put it that way. But also the United Nations gets a lot accomplished. A lot of people have marveled at how much they actually do get accomplished, not only in the peace and security area and helping to diffuse problems such as the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961, which literally could have obliterated humankind as we know it had it gone forward. We were literally ready to push the red button. It was that close, one button away from atomic annihilation almost. But the UN does a lot of things like helping to move ships, aircraft, mail, weather information around the world. There are 15 UN peacekeeping missions in very dangerous areas, but there are a lot of areas where these countries do come together and work together in a constructive way, and you've highlighted that in your book.
Yeah, it is interesting. I don't think the average person, I mean, certainly I didn't know until I really got involved in studying the UN, you know, how our daily lives can be affected through these agencies and organizations that really facilitate our, you know, whether it's global travel or getting our mail delivered or helping with dealing with tsunamis or hurricanes, etc. And so that is obviously a function that everyone enjoys the benefits of.
And so often we don't think about this. We don't think about, we get on a plane, maybe we fly to wherever it may be, to Japan or to Bolivia or wherever, and we don't think about how those rules and regulations come together to help that aircraft arrive to its destination safely. Or people may take a cruise in the Caribbean or in the Mediterranean, and they don't think about how those ships operate on the high seas. But the Coast Guards, the Navies, they all know how that happens because they work closely with the International Maritime Organization, a UN agency, or if you move mail around the world. So these are services that we take for granted, but there's so many that impact our lives every day. I've had the same experience you've had. You mentioned you've gone out to talk to people, and some people say, well, the UN is all powerful, the UN can't do anything right, which is wrong on both counts, but they don't have a lot of basic information. How can we get, or not me, but how can the media get information out to help people better understand the UN and do it in an objective way? Not do a puff piece, say the UN is great, because no organization is perfect. We all know that. As Madeleine Albright said, the UN is indispensable, but it has its warts and imperfections. Right. But how can the public better understand the UN?
Well, I think speaking as a journalist, you can't report on something unless there's really a story. And so that requires that the agency, whatever agency it is doing something that's deemed to be helpful or new or having an impact. And so I think that, you know, you mentioned puff pieces. I mean, I don't think anyone, you know, it doesn't help any organization to have puff pieces because they're disregarded. But I think when the UN is heavily engaged and the public knows about it, because whether it's an issue, like for example, during the Iraq situation with Saddam Hussein, after the first Gulf War and sanctions were and disarmament was going on, that drove a lot of coverage of the UN because people were fascinated with it. You felt that it was front page news, the UN was driving it, and so people were very interested in the UN. And as a result, I always say that I owe my career to Saddam Hussein because when I started, when he, you know, invaded Kuwait, and he basically occupied center stage for a dozen years, when you really think about it. And that then allowed journalists to cover other aspects of the UN because we were here. And so I think that an institution needs something like that to really keep people fascinated. I mean, I think a lot of times now they're really, the UN is perhaps more in low gear or low medium gear. and thus there aren't as many journalists here on a daily basis. And so you're not going to get as much coverage. You're not going to have as much opportunity to delve deep. Because when there's a hot issue, then people are interested in looking under it, digging into it, seeing various aspects. And so, but then again, there are cycles to conflict, so who knows? Next week there could be something.
There probably will be, unfortunately.
Right, unfortunately.
But that brings to mind the Libyan situation, not at the beginning of 2011, I guess it was, and the role the United Nations played, and it played a very critical role. The General Assembly played a key role, the Security Council did, the International Criminal Court, Muammar Gaddafi was referred to the International Criminal Court. UN agencies went in and are still helping to provide assistance to people. The UN World Food Program are operating there. OCHA, the Humanitarian Affairs Operation from the UN. You've got the UN High Commission for Refugees. But there's that whole panoply of UN players. But if you read articles on these particular issues, very little is said about the UN. In fact, in most articles, it's never even mentioned.
I know. I think that's a perennial problem for the UN. As we know, the UN is the first to arrive generally and working with various NGOs providing humanitarian assistance, but there's maybe because there's not a focal point. It could be that there are so many.
Well, Linda Fasulo, is a very important organization, very important book that you have written, An Insider's Guide to the United Nations. And I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.